Hi, I'm Michael.
And I'm Justin.
And this is our podcast where we discuss what we find interesting about the intersection of Web3 and digital security as we know it.
Between us, we have years of experience securing digital products and infrastructure, which has led us to be constantly curious about what's next.
Which is what this podcast is about, sharing our journey as we update our mental models for security in the next internet.
Hello, and welcome back to Not Your Crypto Podcast with myself, Justin, and...
Michael.
Hey, sorry to put you on spot like that.
That's all right.
How you doing, Michael? You good?
No, because Windows is messing with me, as we were just talking about. I don't know. It's not working. But
oh, man. It's had such a promising start, didn't it?
It did.
Well, we gave it a good try. So, yes, welcome back to our podcast where we discuss all things Web3, effectively. Not the crypto part, obviously. That's given away by the title. We like to just talk about what we think Web3 is, what it can do, what it's doing right now, and where it may be going. And we also do this through the lens of security engineers, dyed-in-the-wool security engineers. This week, after doing a technical analysis last week, is more of a brainstorming session. We basically had the idea, we were wondering, actually, I guess we were musing would be the more accurate term. Are there, given our propensity or our experience of using many different types of tooling to basically conduct our craft of product security, internal security, consumer-facing security as engineers, do we ever think there are some products that could be Web3 based used in our space being a corporate entity that needs its data protecting, needs its identity protected, its employees protected? Do we ever look at some of the tools that we use now and think, oh, now that we look back in hindsight with all we've learned so far and still to learn about how Web3 works, how the Web3 tech stack works and the advantages it has, as well as its disadvantages, do we think we could have a tool that is based on Web3 stack? So that's basically what today's session is going to be about, is us kind of brainstorming, spitballing, half-baked ideas, fully baked ideas, and some really bad ideas about where we see Web3 being able to go into a space. And the ironic thing about this is I can see us being able to extrapolate out to other ideas, not just necessarily security tooling ideas, but just engineering ideas in general. But then also, spoiler alert, I think this is also going to cycle back to with the why. When we get to the question of the why it hasn't happened yet, I think it's going to cycle back to our first ever episode as to why we're here and why we are bullish on Web3 tech. Michael, does that sound like an exciting episode to you?
It does sound like an exciting episode to me. I think over the past few years, especially as crypto went through its not crypto, I guess it's kind of like Web3 went through its original hype cycle. I forget how many years ago that was now. Feels like a lot, but it wasn't actually, I think.
No, it wasn't.
And everybody, there were a lot of ideas and products and companies and hype and whatever thrown out around how and if and when to use blockchain itself or crypto ideas or Web3 in the enterprise, right? And there were all those jokes about how companies were just throwing it in to boost up things or generate hype or whatever. And yeah, for sure a lot of that fizzled out and fizzled down, right?
It got reduced to a meme. I saw a meme the other day where it's just a whiteboard. I need a blockchain for this? The answer was just no. It's just a flow diagram to a no box.
Yeah. So I think that's interesting, right? There's some looking back to do. There's some looking forward to do. So let's.
Yeah. And so when I was thinking about this offline, I was like, okay, so we're security engineers. So we're obviously going to look through the lens of security and privacy. And I was like, well, let's flip this question on its head. What problems lend themselves to being solved by a solution that uses a Web3 tech stack? And then that took me down the garden path of, well, effectively, Web3 tech stacks are platforms, right? Because effectively what you're doing is you're enabling trustless collaboration between parties. That's what it's supposed to do. It removes the middleman, removes a third party that you need to trust or, I don't know, convey any sense of authority to, and trust by definition, and allows you to trust another peer for the sake of both of you gaining something out of this relationship. And so then that's what then spun me, because I was like, oh, okay, this is also starting to give me shades of, well, why don't we see a Web3 startup that's now grown up in the last 10 years to become the size of an Uber or an Airbnb or something like that? And as we said we kind of we kind of did hint at this in our first episode, there's because it doesn't allow complete value capture to a single entity. Value is distributed to all participants. Anyway, so what problems do I think this is solving? I mean, that is a philosophical why that we can delve into later into the thing, but that's basically literally where my natural train of thought went. So one of the things that came to mind immediately for me then was, okay, data sharing. Imagine you have a competitor, for example, in your field, but there are certain things where you both mutually benefit from sharing certain data points. We're security professionals. Both of us know what threat intelligence is. For those that aren't security professionals, threat intelligence is the idea of being told what adversaries are doing generally, where they're going with their attacks, the type of attacks they're launching, how often, etc., etc. It gives you all those things. There are companies that charge a pretty penny for threat intelligence, and there are many security professionals who have a wide varying opinion on whether you need threat intelligence. Favorite answer from a security professional? It depends. And so I'm not here to sell you threat intelligence. I do not work or I've never been affiliated with a threat intelligence company. But funnily enough, I was like, okay, when I started going through this path of, okay, so we've got mutual parties who have a mutual distrust, but can also benefit from sharing data because they face the same problems. Security teams in, I don't know, let's just pick a random vertical. I'm going to go with oil and gas. So Shell, ExxonMobil, anyone else, in that field, they are obviously competitors, but when they both suffer the same security problems, probably I imagine that security adversaries are the same profile. If their security teams could share data about what type of attacks they're seeing, they both stand to mutually benefit. And so that's when I hit up on this. Okay, they both probably signed up to an individual threat intelligence service that takes in data points from the market or from the actual, wider world, and then says, these are the things you're seeing. These are the things that you should be selling. I'm like, well, how about you remove the threat intelligence, because you have your own embedded security teams. I know for a fact they have their own embedded security teams. They probably have better fidelity of data in terms of what they're seeing actually on the ground. Imagine if they could share that without having to actually share corporate data or sharing too much data that could basically give their peer now a competitive advantage. So it's all about context. What I'm trying to say here is your competitors at one context, but you're also peers in another context, and you can serve to it. So one of the ideas that came to me was Web3 helps perfectly here, because Web3 is basically can do or can support, and I think we did discuss this in a previous podcast. I know I've definitely spoken to you about it, Michael, the concept of multi-party computing, where you share data, but you don't share the owner of said data, but everyone has access to that data. I probably butchered that technical implementation, but a blockchain is a really, really good implementation to do that. In long story short, you have some competitors in a vertical. They need to share this data that everyone benefits from them doing it. How do you do it without actually giving away who gave you that data in the first place? For example, Shell doesn't need to know that this came from ExxonMobil, and ExxonMobil doesn't need to know that this came from BP. But they are all seeing these types of attacks. Multi-party computing allows you to obfuscate that, and then blockchain allows you to share it. That was one concept that came to me. And how would we do that? I was like, oh, okay. So you could kind of have like a decentralized autonomous organization, a DAO. They all stump up some money to be a part of it. And then they decide mutually that this is a good thing. And they start sharing data. I'm going to stop there. That was just one random idea. But basically, the principle here is mutually benefits organizations that are normally competitors, but they stand to mutually benefit from it. Michael, what do you think around the philosophy of what Web3 enables and my random idea of, okay, this could be a thing? And then we'll get to the why it hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, that's pretty fleshed. That was a much more fleshed out idea that I thought you had about this. That's interesting. Um,
Thank you. Yeah, I've incorporated the company. No, I'm kidding.
yeah, patent pending.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think like I agree that the kind of key like surface here is like trustless collaboration has always kind of been the like catchphrase for like what problem does Web3 does I guess block. I never know which word to use, right?
Dude, I don't even know. I got chastised the other day that we don't use Web3. I was like, I'm using Web3. I don't care. I'm not changing again.
Yeah. I don't know. But like, I think we kind of mean all three of those words to refer to
Yeah.
like nearly the same thing in this case.
Yeah,
At
it
least.
is. Yeah.
But yeah, like trustless collaboration is kind of what people describe the problem space that this technology solves.
Mm-hmm.
And I think whenever you're talking about like, yeah, different businesses that are competitors or that are in the same vertical, you want to say that there isn't trust necessarily between them. Like
Mm-hmm.
it would kind of make sense in a way to say like that. Yeah, it's probably better if there isn't trust between them. At least would be one way of putting
Mm-hmm.
it.
Yeah.
But then there are problems that they probably do want to collaborate on, like problems that cause some negative effect on all of them. It's like I guess it's like that game theory kind of stuff, right? Not that I know anything about that, but it's like I don't know if it's prisoner's dilemma or like whatever else the other ones
feels,
are.
Yeah.
But like where if they
something
collaborate,
like
they're all better off, but they don't want to because they don't trust each other or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So that's interesting. I never thought about like threat intel as a space for that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because I guess like I don't know if this is getting kind of too far into the why not stuff, but um like what you're describing there is basically pretty classic like disintermediation, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's like there's a platform whose like primary kind of business is to be in the middle between
Mm-hmm.
between a bunch of different things. In this case, it's like data sources, I
Mm-hmm.
guess,
Yeah.
and then kind of bundle them together and provide that kind of value like to downstream consumers, right?
Yeah.
And it's kind of sounds to me like what you're describing is like, is it does this technology allow disintermediation of this particular platform? Yeah,
Yeah.
maybe.
Maybe.
I guess it
Yeah.
could.
Basically. So okay,
I think
so,
like the hard part, like coming from like more directly from the security angle, the hard part
mm-hmm.
that then I think about that is like one of the keys that you're talking about is kind of not revealing identity through the data. And that seems to me like non-trivial necessarily,
No.
right? Like whenever you're
Agreed.
sharing data, there's always some like, not always, that's probably a bit too strong, but there's often some side channel or some
Mm-hmm.
way of looking at the data that allows you to attribute it, even if you are, obfuscating, you're kind of intentionally
Mm-hmm.
leaving data points out or whatever.
Yeah.
That kind of maybe comes up as a sticking point to me in
Yeah,
terms
it
of like getting
definitely
people to
does.
buy into an idea like that.
100%. And so,
Yeah.
again, it depends on the context, right? Because how valuable is it? So, for example, the reason no, it's not the reason, but it actually coincidentally works though. For example, me chasing oil and gas vertical, they're not terribly innovative companies. So I can't imagine there's a brand new product somewhere. Maybe even when they discover new fields, it's not necessarily sensitive information. That's me talking from the outside, having worked a little bit in that space. But it's not necessarily super sensitive information, but I doubt that would come up unless you say, hey, for some strange reason, I don't know, our Montreal office is starting to see all these random attacks. And then BP goes, wait, why are you drilling in Montreal? And then they start running over. So then they're like, oh, there's a new field. I don't know. But basically, yeah you're right.
I mean,
the deobfuscation is non-trivial. But then, okay, so now let's turn that on its head.
Okay.
When you have these threat intelligence, these third parties, you're basically sending. No, I'm making assumptions about how threat intelligence companies work and where they gather their data. But if they do take it from individual customers, then how are they protecting it and making sure that that doesn't get spilled out?
I think like one way to approach it is like, you could. Like we could talk about it more specifically about like what kind of data would be shared and what would be useful. Like for example, like a kind of MVP kind of approach, I don't know, idea for this would be
Mm-hmm.
um, like let's just say like a surprising amount of threat intel comes down to like IP addresses or something, right? Like in terms of uh, knowing what bad actors are doing on the internet or what certain actors are
Yeah.
doing on the internet. Like let's just say it, like simplifying assumption wise, that a lot of it comes
Mm-hmm.
down to a data point like an IP address.
Mm-hmm.
That is probably a data point that you could write somewhere
Mm-hmm.
um, without revealing yourself, like
Mm-hmm.
without attributing it to yourself. Like if I just put out, you know, this kind of threat activity coming from this IP address,
Mm-hmm.
um, it's probably reasonable to say like maybe that can't be attributed back to me as the person who wrote
Mm-hmm.
that there. Um, so if you think about like a threat intel platform, let's say like a very, very simple model of a threat intel platform is it has some devices that it has some way of listening for like threat activity coming from IP addresses from
Mm-hmm.
all, a bunch of different places, and then collating it together and then publishing it as a feed. And the feed is
By the
literally
way,
just IP address.
I was thinking Splunk agents configured by the DAO kind of thing.
Yo,
Not that I've really thought this too in depth about
we'll
this.
get there.
Yeah.
um, but yeah, like so, I guess that's a very simple model where like you have
Mm-hmm.
this intermediary player who
Mm-hmm.
exists because like the value that they provide is one, they are basically a place to write data to for these disparate
Yeah.
organizations to write data to.
Mm-hmm.
Then yeah, maybe that's a setup for that kind of disintermediation where instead of everybody writes an IP address, right, that
Mm-hmm.
says this activity, this IP address, instead of writing that
Mm-hmm.
to a platform,
Yeah.
could it be written somewhere else,
Somewhere
somewhere
else.
more distributed and trustless?
Exactly.
Probably, right?
And I'm just keeping an eye on the time here. So I had a second idea that was basically a variation on the first, which was attestations as well, which is basically, for example, when you have regulatory requirements that you are certified by a body to handle a thing, there are now companies that are saying, because as a vendor, you're going to have multiple partners have multiple vendors, and they're tired of asking each other, can you send me your attestations, or can I check on your attestations? Let's just have a third party that hosts these things and shares it out. And it's like, again, disintermediating that. So what I want to talk about here is incentives here, because I think this is the more interesting part of this conversation, and I'm definitely know you do
Okay,
too.
we'll talk about the Splunk ages later.
Yeah, we'll talk about Splunk agents later
That'll be
collectively.
offline.
Basically, why this hasn't happened yet, because long story short, disintermediation also means what follows is basically a distribution of the value in terms of providing this service, because now the effort is shared amongst the participants as opposed to the effort being basically being undertaken by one third party who then gets to charge you for the service and capture the value and make money, and there's their profit motive. Now, when you have peer-to-peer transactions like that, it's a case of, well, we both mutually benefit. I don't need to pay you, you don't need to pay me. But so who captures the value? And I think this cycles back to the first episode in terms of when you distribute value like this, you disincentivize, into my mind, you disincentivize your average entrepreneur, because they're like, well, why would I build this thing in which I don't directly benefit myself, but the participants of the network itself do? And that's when you're like, okay, so this then took me down a whole, well, no, I don't want to say crypto anarchic, but I was like, wait, or crypto utopian almost, because then I'm like, all right, so we no longer, if we're going back to like even Adam Smith and capitalism here, you see how big it gets, right? I'm like, well, the whole idea is that your selfishness motivates you to provide a service that you benefit from and that benefits society. But if you then decentralize that motivation, your selfishness is no longer the main that's been taken out. Like, everyone else is now benefiting from collaboration. So now it's about a mutually, now you've got to want other people to benefit as well as yourself. So I don't know, I'm rambling here, but
Okay.
basically what I'm trying to say here is the disintermediation leads to a decentralization. Decentralization basically means the value is spread out. The value can't be captured by one entity. It's now spread out. So therefore, that to me disincentivizes someone. That's my thesis. Disincentivizes an entrepreneur going, okay, let me build this thing, because Otherwise, I'm just going to build another intermediation service where I can capture all the thing. That's the most obvious manifestation of it. And I think Web3 forces you to think with the decentralized part, the decentralized part of Web3, because there's centralized Web3 services. With decentralized part of Web3, basically forces you to think differently about that value capture in of itself, to my mind. And that's why I think this hasn't happened. And that's why I think in general, when people are like looking for a Web3 unicorn and saying, well, you guys have been around for ages and there's no use case, there are plenty of use cases. I just think they don't show up or manifest in a way that you care about. If you're a capitalist, an entrepreneur is like, give me the loot. I don't know. What do you think of my thesis there?
I think, yeah, like the idea that so like, why hasn't it happened yet is sort of the question, right? And I think in order to start answering that question, you have to say, like, what do I expect to happen? You know? Like, and I think when again, like casting back to when that hype kind of cycle was going on, like what did people expect to happen? I think it's kind of like what you were describing, right? Like maybe people expected a bunch of Web3 startups and unicorns, like classically VC funded, doing series rounds. I know nothing about all this stuff, but you know what I mean? Except for like what floats around on Twitter or whatever.
Yeah, of course.
And then, they go public and there's big Web3 companies and this sort of thing. So like, if that's what I expected to happen, and then I try to answer the question, like, why didn't something like that happen? I think what you're saying makes sense, right? Like, it's difficult applying the kind of like Web 2 tech enterprise model to building something in Web 3 is difficult because like like we talked about again in the first episode, like the Web 2 approach, the platform approach of Web 2 is about centralization of let's say code and control over code and also kind of by extension data. And then using that to produce value for the enterprise, right?
Yeah.
So yeah,
exploiting it. I wouldn't even say exploiting, using. Yeah, same thing.
Yeah, I think that kind of depends on your like political angle to it, I guess.
Oh yeah, no. This episode has moved me all the way to the far. No, I'm kidding.
So like, I think that's like one cohesive story you can tell is like, this was expected to happen. It didn't happen. It like failed to happen, or it was a fail. People tried and there were failures, something. And then you kind of look at why and say like, maybe this is why. I think it's also kind of interesting to think about like, what else could I think could happen, or what else could I expect could happen here, right? Because like, I guess here's a parallel that's very similar, maybe.
Go on.
We'll find out if it's similar, I guess, as we go off the cuff here.
Okay.
Like something else that's very similar to this is open source, which I think I've also talked about, right?
I had this thought when I was going through this. I was like, how is this not the same as open source? Go on.
Yeah, is there an open source unicorn? I don't know, it's probably, maybe there is, I don't know. But like, is there like these massive open source enterprises that are based off of extract, like, I don't know. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
No, you don't. Whatever. But
no.
And like you could say like, no, there aren't. Like open source, its success isn't really measured in the commercial arena that way, right?
Yeah.
Open source's success is different, and the way that it happens looks different, both technically and socially, right? Because you could also look at that question and say like, are there massive enterprises that are open source enterprises? And say like, basically yes, like basically every tech company is a massive enterprise built on open source software.
Open source, it is. Oh my god!
Like it's and it's the same thing, right? Like the value of open source is distributed, so it's difficult to kind of collect together and build a vertical enterprise off of.
Yeah.
So was that like, is it successful or not? It depends on what your success is.
It depends on what your success. And I think you've just kind of squared a circle for me, actually, in terms of with the model I should be applying, and the model that I'm surprised people didn't apply, especially all these super clever VCs. Maybe they did. I don't know, not to denigrate any of them, but I'm like, yeah, why did they think? Because obviously, to their mind, like as far as I'm aware, in VC land, Web3 kind of is a promise that never lived up to it's a solution that never had a problem, and it's never lived up to its hype. But then I'm like, well, if you applied the open source model to it in terms of impact and potential impact, I think you're looking at a whole different thing there, and it's very obvious where its advantages are. So I really like the fact that you've applied the open source thing, because for example, yeah, when you think about it, all of these tech giants are built on open source tooling, they're built on open source systems. And when you think about like Linux's impact on the world, it cannot be understated, and that is completely and utterly open source. I mean, you spun off there were entire companies that spun off. So yeah, that's a really good model. I really like you bringing that one to the fore, and yeah, you've given me some food for
Yeah,
thought.
but like I don't think Web3 is there, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
even by that measure of like has it happened? I think
Mm.
the answer is still no. Like
No, yeah.
it's not the case that it has like woven itself into the life of a
Mm-hmm.
person on the internet the
Mm-hmm.
way that open source has, right?
True.
Um and so like the answer to has that happened is still no.
Mm-hmm.
But when I think about like projecting forward in
Mm-hmm.
like how will this thing again, yeah, like weave itself into our lives, I think it's more
Mm-hmm.
like the latter than the former.
Yeah, 100%. And some of the stuff I advise any of our listeners, to just Google what stuff is being built in Web3 right now. There's some really cool stuff, like around Deepin, and I'll stay away from the DeFi stuff, but yeah, Deepin and just general. There are companies, there are entities who want to do some interesting who are using Web3 applications in some interesting ways, and they will come to the fore in the next few years. I've definitely seen that beyond just NFTs. You don't need to worry about the hype. But yeah, I think in terms of it, that is the mantra right now, is how do you get the next billion users on Web3? And it's like, well, you don't get them on Web3. You build it will just be interwoven into their life because there is a solution. It makes sense to use a solution and disintermediate, as opposed to thinking you're going to build a product and then suddenly shove that into their lives. I think I think applications and processes will change because they will use Web3. I think it will be like, to me, the way I look at it is like the infrastructure play, right? Do I care that the website I'm using is hosted on AWS or Azure? No one cares. But you will find that there will be applications that are decentralized in nature and use blockchain technology underneath the hood, but you just won't notice it because you don't need to.
Yeah, but I think there still needs to be a advantage that
Oh,
drives
definitely.
that forward, right? Like
Yeah.
again, like going back to the open source stuff, like the advantage that kind of helped open source like eat up internet infrastructure was
Mm-hmm.
that it was free, right? Like it was that like companies could use it for free, and it
Yeah.
was um, generally like maintained and
Mm-hmm.
it was familiar to the technical people that were building things in the companies, and like there were a lot of drivers that
Mm-hmm.
contributed to it weaving its way into things that way.
Mm-hmm.
Web3, I think, is different. I think
Mm-hmm.
the set of advantages that it offers to like a person on the internet are different.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I and I think that means that the way that I think that means that its adoption curve and process is also different.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think this is also something we talked about in an earlier episode, which was like is it inevitable that it happens or is it not? Um,
Inevitable that what happens, that it is adopted
yeah,
on a wide scale.
yeah,
Whew,
yeah.
I'm not
That's
gonna
fine. That's
predict that
fine. But I
future.
think
That's a good one, though.
like when I think about like what advantages does it offer to a person on the internet, like I think about our um the way that it shifts control kind of back to the client side of the equation as opposed to the server side of the equation. But that is a difficult thing to I don't know what the word is, to bring up to the surface level of
Yeah.
like impact on a user, right?
Long story short, it's got to be wanted. It's got to be a desired state for a user to chase in order for them to care about the value of control. Especially when you've been trained into a behavior where I just sign the T's and C's and give over control just because I want to use this thing. So I think there has to be a demand, and it has to be a genuine demand for that thing to happen. And I think it's not, you can't say carte blanche, that demand's never going to be there. I think it's going to depend on context.
Mm-hmm.
I think it really is going to depend on the context of whatever the function or whether the application of the user is. And so that's where I'm like, that's what brings me back to the incentives here. The other reason why I want to kind of talk to you about the incentive organization thing is because I know you're kind of a very stoic person. And it's like, and I've been described that way as myself as well. Or the idea, okay, if the incentive isn't there for someone to build this, like they say with open source, the internet is running off the back of thousands of nameless volunteers, basically, and that's kind of
The
similar.
real heroes, yeah.
They're the real heroes, right? And that's kind of similar to what's I see kind of happening with Web3, if it is to be adopted in any way, if it's going to follow this model, or your analogy to its conclusion is, it's going to be volunteers building these things, not gaining value per se, not being able to capture the value per se, but it's almost like providing a public good that people then recognize the value of, like mutual peers, and then going forth. Who's going to build the disintermediated Spotify so that artists can actually directly have a relationship with their fans and get paid directly what they deserve? Because the artists aren't going to build it. No record company is going to build it. That makes no sense. Why would I do that? I can't capture the value. And so it's one of those ones where it's like, okay, so are we basically looking, is Web3 waiting for its angels to come through and kind of like actually, do you see where I'm going with this? Like, I'm
I don't know. I think
articulating it poorly.
No. I think it's true. I don't know what to say. Like, I feel like both of us, in a way, right, are like in a way, like not really part of the Web3 community, right? Like we don't know the people, we don't know what's going on necessarily.
We don't have the clout.
We're definitely more in like an observer position of it right now and everything.
That's a fair point.
So like I don't know how to answer that. It's almost like, at least from that perspective, an outside person looking in, it's almost like it's waiting for its scene, right? Like it's almost like, but I don't want to say that because I know there are lots of people building lots of things in it. So like maybe that's not it. But yeah, I agree. Like it's like open source really does run off of basically massive amounts of volunteer work. And if that volunteer work stops, then it stops as well. Web3, like the way that we're talking about these things in Web3 feels the same. Like, yeah, you need to build these kind of like almost protocol or like platform level pieces, and not necessarily realize the benefit of them yourself to make them a thing that exists, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
100%. And that's, oh, wow. I've just done, yeah. And that's where the crypto comes in, because that's where you've got people who do have, they are trying to build these things, but they also need to eat. And so they assign, oh, we've got this new service, but here's a token. And I already have a bunch of these tokens. And therefore, once there is value in you using my service, it drives the token price. But again, I don't really care about token prices, and neither do you. Okay, I'm looking at the time. That's like 33 minutes. That was a really good episode. That was a great chat. Sorry if we got a bit too high level and philosophical for all of our techies out there, and sorry if we got too technical for all of our philosophical fans out there. So yeah, thank you for listening. In conclusion, then, it's like open source. So let's hope that it follows the same level of impact as open source. Anything else you want to finish on, Michael?
No, I think that's good.
That's good. All right. Thank you very much. And we will speak to you soon.